Hi, welcome back to this channel. Should you not listen to the Chapter 5, Part 6, I would suggest you to listen to it first. You can find the video in my playlist. Without further ado, shall we start? Let's enjoy yourself with the book, A Study of History by Arnold J. Toynbee. Last chapter, Argument. Introduction. The unit of historical study. The intelligence units of historical study are not nations or periods but societies. An examination of English history, chapter by chapter, shows that it is not intelligible as a thing in itself but only as a part of a larger whole. This whole contains parts that are subject to identical stimuli or challenges but react to them in different ways. An example from Hellenic history is introduced to illustrate this. The whole, or society, to which England belongs is identified as Western Christendom. Its extension in space at different dates is measured, and its origins in time. It is found to be older, but only slightly older, than the articulation of its parts. Exploration of its beginnings reveals the existence of another society which is now dead, namely the Greco-Roman or Hellenic society, to which ours is affiliated. It is also obvious that there are a number of other living societies, the Orthodox Christian, the Islamic, the Hindu and the Far Eastern societies, and also certain fossilized relics of, at this stage, unidentified societies such as the Jews and the Parsis. 2. The comparative study of civilizations. The purpose of this chapter is to identify, define, and name all the societies, or, rather, civilizations, for there are also primitive or non-civilized societies, which have come into existence so far. The first method of search to employ is to take the existing civilizations already identified, examine their origins, and see if we can find civilizations now extinct to which these are affiliated, as Western Christendom has been found to be affiliated to the Hellenic civilization. The marks of this relationship are a universal state, itself the outcome of a time of troubles, followed by an interregnum, in which appear a church and a Volkerwanderung of barbarians in an heroic age. The church and the Volkerwanderung are the products, respectively, of the internal and external proletariats of a dying civilization. Employing these clues, we find that the Orthodox Christian society is, like our own Western society, affiliated to the Hellenic society. Tracing the Islamic society back to its origins, we find that it is itself a fusion of two originally distinct societies, the Iranic and the Arabic. Tracing these back to their origin, we find, behind 1,000 years of Hellenic intrusion, an extinct society, to be called the Syriac society. Behind the Hindu society, we find an Indi society. Behind the Far Eastern society, we find a Cynic society. The fossils are found to be survivals from one or other of the extinct societies already identified. Behind the Hellenic society, we find the Minoan society, but we observe that the Hellenic society, unlike the other affiliated societies so far identified, did not take over a religion discovered by the internal proletariat of its predecessor. It might therefore be regarded as being not strictly affiliated to it. Behind the Indi society, we find a Sumeric society. As offspring of the Sumeric society, we find two more societies, a Hittite and a Babylonic. The Egyptiac society had no predecessor and no successor. In the New World, we can identify four societies, the Andean, the Yucatec, the Mexic and the Mayan. Thus we have in all 19 specimens of civilizations. And, if we divide the Orthodox Christian society into Orthodox Byzantine and Orthodox Russian, and the Far Eastern into Chinese and Japanese Korean, we have 21. 3. The comparability of society civilizations and primitive society civilizations have at any rate one point in common, that they are a separate class from primitive societies. These latter are very much more numerous but also very much smaller individually. The misconception of the unity of civilization, the erroneous idea that there is only one civilization, namely our own, is examined and dismissed. Also the diffusionist theory that all civilization had its origin in Egypt. The case for the comparability of civilizations are, relatively speaking, a very recent phenomenon in human history, the earliest of them having originated no more than 6,000 years ago. It is proposed to treat them as philosophically contemporaneous members of a single species. The half-truth, history does not repeat itself, is exposed as constituting no valid objection to the procedure proposed. History, science, and fiction, these are three different methods of viewing and presenting the objects of our thought and, among them, the phenomena of human life. The differences between these three techniques are examined, and the uses of science and fiction in the presentation of the theme of history are discussed. 2. The genesis of civilizations. 4. The problem and how not to solve it. The problem stated of our 21 civilized societies. 15 are affiliated to previous civilizations, but 6 have emerged direct from primitive life. Primitive societies existing today are static, but it is clear that they must originally have been dynamically progressive. Social life is older than the human race itself. It is found among insects and animals, and it must have been under the aegis of primitive societies that subman rose to the level of man, a greater advance than any civilization has as yet achieved. However, primitive societies as we know them are static. The problem is, why and how was this primitive cake of custom broken? Race. The factor we are looking for must be either some special quality in the human beings who started civilizations, or some special features of their environment at the time, or some interaction between the two. The first of these views, namely that there is some innately superior race, e.g. the Nordic race, in the world, which is responsible for the creation of civilizations, is examined and rejected. Environment. The view that certain environments, presenting easy and comfortable conditions of life, provide the key to an explanation of the origin of civilizations, is examined and rejected. V. Challenge and response. The mythological clue. The fallacy in the two views already examined and rejected is that they apply the procedure of material sciences, biology and geology, to a problem that is really spiritual. A survey of the great myths in which the wisdom of the human race is enshrined suggests the possibility that man achieves civilization, not as a result of superior biological endowment or geographical environment, but as a response to a challenge in a situation of special difficulty which rouses him to make a hitherto unprecedented effort. The myth applied to the problem. Before the dawn of civilization, the Euphrasian steppe was a well-watered grassland. The prolonged and progressive desiccation of this grassland presented its inhabitants with a challenge to which they responded in various ways. Some stood their ground and changed their habits, thus evolving the nomadic manner of life. Others shifted their ground southwards, following the retreating grassland to the tropics, and thus preserved their primitive way of life, which they are still living today. Others entered the marshes and jungles of the Nile Delta and, faced with the challenge it presented, set to work to drain it, and they evolved the Egyptiac civilization. The Sumeric civilization originated in the same way and from the same causes in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta. The Cynic civilization originated in the Yellow River Valley. The nature of the challenge which started it is unknown, but it is clear that the conditions were severe rather than easy. The Mayan civilization originated from the challenge of a tropical forest, the Andean from that of a bleak plateau. The Minoan civilization originated from the challenge of the sea. Its founders were refugees from the desiccating coasts of Africa who took to the water and settled in Crete and other Aegean islands. They did not, in the first instance, come from the nearer mainlands of Asia or Europe. In the cases of the affiliated civilizations, the challenge that brought them into existence must have come primarily not from geographical factors but from their human environment, i.e. from the dominant minorities of the societies to which they are affiliated. A dominant minority is, by definition, a ruling class that has ceased to lead and has become oppressive. To this challenge, the internal and external proletariats of the failing civilization respond by seceding from it and thereby laying the foundations of a new civilization. 6. The virtues of adversity. The explanation of the genesis of civilizations given in the last chapter rests on the hypothesis that it is difficult rather than easy conditions that produce these achievements. This hypothesis is now brought nearer to proof by illustrations taken from localities where civilization once flourished but subsequently failed and where the land has reverted to its original condition. What was once the scene of the Mayan civilization is now again tropical forest. The Indic civilization in Ceylon flourished in the rainless half of the island. This is now entirely barren, though the ruins of the Indi irrigation system remain as evidence of the civilization that once flourished there. The ruins of Petra and Palmyra stand on small oases in the Arabian desert. Easter Island, one of the remotest spots in the Pacific, is proved by its statues to have been once a center of the Polynesian civilization. New England, whose European colonists have played a predominant part in the history of North America, is one of the bleakest and most barren parts of that continent. The Latin townships of the Roman Campania, till recently a malarial wilderness, made a great contribution to the rise of the Roman power. Contrast the favorable situation and poor performance of Capua. Illustrations are also drawn from Herodotus, the Odyssey, and the Book of Exodus. The natives of Nyasaland, where life is easy, remained primitive savages down to the advent of invaders from a distant and inclement Europe. 7. The challenge of the environment, the stimulus of hard countries, a series of pairs of contiguous environments is adduced. In each case, the former is the harder country and has also had the more brilliant record as an originator of one form or other of civilization: the Yellow River Valley and the Yanks Valley. Attica and Boeotia, Byzantium and Chalcedon, Israel, Phoenicia, Philistia, Brandenburg and the Rhineland, Scotland and England, the various groups of European colonists in North America. The stimulus of new ground, we find that virgin soil produces more vigorous responses than land which has already been broken in and thus rendered easier by previous civilized occupants. Thus, if we take each of the affiliated civilizations, we find that it has produced its most striking early manifestations in places outside the area occupied by the parent civilization. The superiority of the response evoked by new ground is most strikingly illustrated when the new ground has to be reached by a sea passage. Reasons for this fact are given, and also for the phenomenon that the epic develops in homelands and drama in overseas settlements. The stimulus of blows. Various examples from Hellenic and Western history are given to illustrate the point that a sudden crushing defeat is apt to stimulate the defeated party to set its house in order and prepare to make a victorious response. The stimulus of pressures. Various examples show that peoples occupying frontier positions, exposed to constant attack, achieve a more brilliant development than their neighbors in more sheltered positions. Thus the Osmanlis, thrust up against the frontier of the East Roman Empire, fared better than the Karamanlis to the east of them. Austria had a more brilliant career than Bavaria thanks to being exposed to the prolonged assault of the Ottoman Turks. The situation and fortunes of the various communities in Britain between the fall of Rome and the Norman conquest is examined from this point of view. The stimulus of penalizations. Certain classes and races have suffered for centuries from various forms of penalization imposed upon them by other classes or races who have had the mastery over them. Penalized classes or races generally respond to this challenge of being excluded from certain opportunities and privileges by putting forth exceptional energy and showing exceptional capacity in such directions as are left open to them, much as the blind develop exceptional sensitivity of hearing. Slavery is perhaps the heaviest of penalizations, but out of the hordes of slaves imported into Italy from the eastern Mediterranean during the last 2 centuries BC arose a freedman class which proved alarmingly powerful. From this slave world, too, came the new religions of the internal proletariat, among them Christianity. The fortunes of various groups of conquered Christian peoples under Osmanli rule are examined from the same standpoint, particularly the case of the Phanariots. This example and that of the Jews are used to prove that so-called racial characteristics are not really racial at all but are due to the historical experiences of the communities in question. 8. The golden mean: enough and too much. Can we say simply, the sterner the challenge the finer the response? Or is there such a thing as a challenge too severe to evoke a response? Certainly some challenges which have defeated one or more parties that have encountered them have ultimately provoked a victorious response. For example, the challenge of expanding Hellenism proved too much for the Celts but was victoriously answered by their successors the Teutons. The Hellenic intrusion into the Syriac world evoked a series of unsuccessful Syriac responses: the Zoroastrian, the Jewish, the Nestorian and the Monophysite, but the 5th response, that of Islam, was successful. Comparisons in 3 terms. Nonetheless, it can be proved that challenges can be too severe, i.e. the maximum challenge will not always produce the optimum response. The Viking emigrants from Norway responded splendidly to the severe challenge of Iceland but collapsed before the severer challenge of Greenland. Massachusetts presented European colonists with a severer challenge than Dixie and evoked a better response, but Labrador, presenting a severer challenge still, proved too much for them. Other examples follow, e.g. the stimulus of blows can be too severe, especially if prolonged, as in the effect of the Hannibalic War on Italy. The Chinese are stimulated by the social challenge involved in emigrating to Malaya but are defeated by the severer social challenge of a white man's country, e.g. California. Finally, varying degrees of challenge presented by civilizations to neighboring barbarians are reviewed. 2 abortive civilizations. This section is a continuation of the argument of the last example in the preceding section. 2 groups of barbarians on the frontiers of Western Christendom in the first chapter of its history were so stimulated that they began to evolve rival civilizations of their own which were, however, nipped in the bud, namely the far western Celtic Christians and the Scandinavian Vikings. These two cases are considered and the consequences that might have ensued if these rivals had not been swallowed and absorbed by the Christian civilization radiating from Rome and the Rhineland. The impact of Islam on the Christendoms on Western Christendom. The effect of this impact was wholly good, and Western culture in the Middle Ages owed much to Muslim Iberia. On Byzantine Christendom, the impact was excessive and evoked a crushing re-erection of the Roman Empire under Leo the Syrian. The case of Abyssinia, a Christian fossil in a fastness encircled by the Muslim world, is also noticed. 3. The growths of civilizations. 9. The arrested civilizations. Polynesians, Eskimos, and nomads. It might seem that, once a civilization had been brought into existence, its growth would be a matter of course. But this is not so, as is proved by the record of certain civilizations which have achieved existence but then failed to grow. The fate of these arrested civilizations has been to encounter a challenge on the borderline between the degree of severity which evokes a successful response and the greater degree which entails defeat. 3 cases present themselves in which a challenge of this kind has come from the physical environment. The result in each case has been a tour de force on the part of the respondents which has so engrossed the whole of their energies that they have had none left over for further development. The Polynesians achieved the tour de force of interinsular voyaging between Pacific islands. It eventually defeated them and they relapsed into primitive life on their several now isolated islands. The Eskimos achieved an extraordinarily skilled and specialized annual cycle adapted to life on the shores of the Arctic. The nomads achieved a similar annual cycle as herdsmen on the semi-desert steppe. The ocean with its islands and the desert with its oases have many points in common. The evolution of nomadism during periods of desiccation is analyzed. It is noted that hunters become agriculturists before taking the further step of becoming nomads. Cain and Abel are types of the agriculturist and the nomad. Nomad incursions into the domains of civilizations are always due either to increased desiccation, pushing the nomad off the steppe, or to the breakdown of a civilization creating a vacuum which pulls the nomad in as a participant in a Volkerwanderung. The Osmanlis. The challenge to which the Ottoman system was a response was the transference of a nomad community to an environment in which they had to rule sedentary communities. They solved their problem by treating their new subjects as human flocks and herds, evolving human equivalents of the sheepdogs of the nomad in the form of a slave household of administrators and soldiers. Other examples of similar nomad empires are mentioned, the Mamluks for instance, but the Osmanli system surpassed all others in efficiency and duration. It suffered, however, like nomadism itself, from a fatal rigidity. The Spartan response to the challenge of overpopulation in the Hellenic world was to evolve a tour de force which in many respects resembles that of the Osmanlis, with the difference that in the Spartan case the military caste was the Spartan aristocracy itself, but they too were slaves, enslaved to the duty they had imposed upon themselves of holding down permanently a population of fellow Greeks. General characteristics. Eskimos and nomads, Osmanlis, and Spartans have 2 features in common: specialization and caste. In all these societies the human beings are degraded by specialization as boatmen, horsemen, or warrior men to a subhuman level in comparison with the all-round men, the ideal of Pericles' funeral speech, who alone are capable of achieving growth in civilization. These arrested societies resemble the societies of bees and ants, which have been stationary since before the dawn of human life on Earth. They also resemble the societies portrayed in utopias. A discussion of utopias follows, in which it is shown that utopias are generally the products of civilizations in decline and are attempts, in so far as they have a practical program, to arrest the decline by pegging the society at its actual level at the moment. The nature of the growths of civilizations. 2 false trails. Growth occurs when the response to a particular challenge is not only successful in itself but provokes a further challenge which again meets with a successful response. How are we to measure such growth? Is it to be measured by an increasing control over the society's external environment? Such an increasing control can be of 2 kinds: increasing control over the human environment, which normally takes the form of conquest of neighboring peoples, and increasing control over the physical environment, which is expressed in improvements in material technique. Examples are then adduced to show that neither of these phenomena, neither political and military expansion nor improvement in technique, is a satisfactory criterion of real growth. Military expansion is normally a result of militarism, which is itself a symptom of decline. Improvements in technique, agricultural or industrial, show little or no correlation with real growth. In fact, technique may well be improving at a time when real civilization is declining, and vice versa. Progress towards self-determination. Real progress is found to consist in a process defined as etherealization, an overcoming of material obstacles which releases the energies of the society to make responses to challenges which henceforth are internal rather than external, spiritual rather than material. The nature of this etherealization is illustrated by examples from Hellenic and modern Western history. 11. An analysis of growth society and the individual. Two traditional views are current as to the relation of society to the individual. One represents a society as simply an aggregate of atomic individuals, and the other regards the society as an organism and the individuals as parts of it, inconceivable except as members or cells of the society to which they belong. Both these views are shown to be unsatisfactory, and the true view is that a society is a system of relations between individuals. Human beings cannot be themselves without interacting with their fellows, and a society is a field of action common to a number of human beings. But the source of action is in the individuals. All growth originates with creative individuals or small minorities of individuals, and their task is twofold. First, the achievement of their inspiration or discovery, whatever it may be, and secondly, the conversion of the society to which they belong to this new way of life. This conversion could, theoretically, come about in one or other of two ways, either by the mass undergoing the actual experience which has transformed the creative individuals, or by their imitation of its externals, in other words, by mimesis. In practice, the latter is the only alternative open in the case of all but a small minority of mankind. Mimesis is a short cut, but it is a route by which the rank and file, en masse, can follow the leaders. Withdrawal and return. Individuals. The action of the creative individual may be described as a twofold motion of withdrawal and return. Withdrawal for the purpose of his personal enlightenment, return for the task of enlightening his fellow men. This is illustrated from Plato's parable of the cave, from St. Paul's analogy of the seed, from the Gospel story and from elsewhere. It is then shown in practical action in the lives of great pioneers: St. Paul, St. Benedict, St. Gregory the Great, the Buddha, Muhammad, Machiavelli, Dante. Withdrawal and return. Creative minorities. Withdrawal followed by return is also characteristic of the sub-societies which form the constituent parts of societies in the proper sense. The period in which such sub-societies make their contributions to the growth of the societies to which they belong is preceded by a period in which they are markedly withdrawn from the general life of their society. For example, Athens in the second chapter of the growth of the Hellenic society, Italy in the second chapter of the growth of the Western society, and England in its third chapter. The possibility that Russia may be going to play a similar role in the fourth chapter is considered. 12. Differentiation through growth. Growth, as described in the foregoing chapter, clearly involves differentiation between the parts of a growing society. At each stage, some parts will make an original and successful response, some will succeed in following their lead by mimesis, some will fail to achieve either originality or mimesis, and succumb. There will also be increasing differentiation between the histories of different societies, and it is obvious that different societies have different predominating characteristics, some excelling in art, some in religion, others in industrial inventiveness. But the fundamental similarity in the purposes of all civilizations is not to be forgotten. Each seed has its own destiny, but the seeds are all of one kind, sown by the same sower, in the hope of the same harvest. 4. The breakdowns of civilizations. 13. The nature of the problem of the 26 civilizations we have identified. 16 are dead and 9 of the remaining 10, all, in fact, except our own, are shown to have already broken down. The nature of a breakdown can be summed up in 3 points: a failure of creative power in the creative minority, which henceforth becomes a merely dominant minority, an answering withdrawal of allegiance and mimesis on the part of the majority, a consequent loss of social unity in the society as a whole. Our next task is to discover the causes of such breakdowns. 14. Deterministic solutions. Some schools of thought have maintained that the breakdowns of civilizations are due to factors outside human control. During the decline of the Hellenic civilization, writers, both pagan and Christian, held that the decay of their society was due to cosmic senescence. But modern physicists have relegated cosmic senescence to an unbelievably distant future, which means that it can have had no effect on any past or present civilizations. Spengler and others have maintained that societies are organisms, with natural transitions from youth and maturity to decay, like other living creatures. But a society is not an organism. Others have held that there is something inevitably dysgenic in the influence of civilization on human nature, and that after a period of civilization the race can only be restored by an infusion of barbaric new blood. This view is examined and dismissed. There remains the cyclic theory of history, as found in Plato's Timaeus, Virgil's Fourth Eclogue, and elsewhere. This probably originated in Chaldean discoveries concerning our own solar system, and the vastly wider vision of modern astronomy has deprived the theory of its astronomical basis. There is no evidence for the theory and much against it. 15. Loss of command over the environment. The argument of this chapter is the converse of that in Chapter 10, where it was shown that an increase in control over the physical environment, as measured by improvement in technique, and an increase in control over the human environment, as measured by geographical expansion or military conquest, are not the criteria or causes of growth. Here it is shown that the decline of technique and the geographical contraction caused by military aggression from outside are not the criteria or causes of breakdowns. The physical environment's several examples are adduced to show that the decay of technical achievement has been a result, not a cause, of breakdown. The abandonment of the Roman roads and of the Mesopotamian irrigation system was a result, not a cause, of the breakdowns of the civilizations that had formerly maintained them. The oncoming of malaria, which is said to have caused breakdowns of civilizations, is shown to have been a result of the breakdowns. The human environment Gibbon's thesis that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was due to barbarism and religion is examined and rejected. These manifestations of the external and internal proletariats of the Hellenic society were consequences of a breakdown of the Hellenic society that had already taken place. Gibbon does not begin his story far enough back. He mistakes the Antonine period for a golden age when it was really an Indian summer. Various examples of successful aggression against civilizations are passed in review, and it is shown that in every case the successful aggression occurred after the breakdown. A negative verdict aggression against a society still in process of growth normally stimulates it to greater effort. Even when a society is already in decline, aggression against it may galvanize it into activity and give it a further lease of life. 16. Failure of self-determination. The mechanicalness of mimesis. The only way in which the uncreative majority can follow the leadership of the creative leaders is by mimesis, which is a species of drill, a mechanical and superficial imitation of the great and inspired originals. This unavoidable shortcut to progress entails obvious dangers. The leaders may become infected with the mechanicalness of their followers, and the result will be an arrested civilization, or they may impatiently exchange the Pied Piper's pipe of persuasion for the whip of compulsion. In that case, the creative minority will become a dominant minority and the disciples will become a reluctant and alienated proletariat. When this happens, the society enters on the road to disintegration. The society loses capacity for self-determination. The following sections illustrate ways in which this comes about. New wine in old bottles. Ideally, each new social force released by creative minorities should beget new institutions through which it can work. Actually, it works more often than not through old institutions designed for other purposes. But the old institutions often prove unsuitable and intractable. One of two results may follow: either the breakup of the institutions or their survival and the consequent perversion of the new forces working through them. A revolution may be defined as a delayed and consequently explosive act of mimesis, an enormity as a frustration of mimesis. If the adjustment of institutions to forces is harmonious, growth will continue. If it results in a revolution, growth becomes hazardous. If it results in an enormity, breakdown may be diagnosed. Then follow a series of examples of the impact of new forces upon old institutions, the first group being impacts of the two great new forces at work in the modern Western society. The impact of industrialism on slavery, e.g. in the southern states of the USA. The impact of democracy and industrialism on war, i.e. the intensification of warfare since the French Revolution. The impact of democracy and industrialism on the parochial state, as shown in the hypertrophy of nationalism and the failure of the free trade movement. The impact of industrialism on private property, as illustrated by the rise of capitalism and communism. The impact of democracy on education, as illustrated by the rise of the yellow press and of fascist dictatorships. The impact of Italian efficiency on transalpine governments, as illustrated by the emergence of despotic monarchies. The impact of the Solonian Revolution on the Hellenic city-states, as illustrated by the phenomena of tyrannus, stasis, and hegemony. The impact of parochialism on the Western Christian Church, as illustrated by the Protestant Revolution, the divine right of kings and the eclipse of Christianity by patriotism. The impact of the sense of unity on religion, as illustrated by the rise of bigotry and persecution. The impact of religion on caste, as shown in the Hindu civilization. The impact of civilization on the division of labor, showing itself as esotericism in the leaders and lopsidedness in the followers. The latter defect is illustrated from cases of penalized minorities, e.g. the Jews, and from aberrations of modern athleticism. The impact of civilization on mimesis, which is directed no longer, as in primitive societies, towards the traditions of the tribe, but towards pioneers. Too often the pioneers selected for imitation are not creative leaders but commercial exploiters or political demagogues. The nemesis of creativity, idolization of an ephemeral self-history, shows that the group which successfully responds to one challenge is rarely the successful respondent to the next. Various examples are given, and it is shown that this phenomenon corresponds with certain fundamental postulates of both Greek and Hebrew thought. Those who have succeeded once are apt, on the next occasion, to be found resting on their oars. The Jews, having responded to the challenges of the Old Testament, are worsted by the challenge of the New. The Athens of Pericles dwindles into the Athens of St. Paul. In the Italian Risorgimento, the centers which have responded in the Renaissance prove ineffective, and the lead is taken by Piedmont, which has had no part in previous Italian glories. South Carolina and Virginia, leading states of the USA in the first and second quarters of the 19th century, have failed to make a recovery from the Civil War comparable with that of the previously undistinguished North Carolina. The nemesis of creativity, idolization of an ephemeral institution, idolization of the city-state proved, in the later stages of Hellenic history, a snare into which the Greeks fell but not the Romans. A ghost of the Roman Empire caused the breakdown of the Orthodox Christian society. Illustrations are also given of the hampering effects of the idolization of kings, parliaments, and ruling castes, whether bureaucracies or priesthoods. The nemesis of creativity, idolization of an ephemeral technique. Illustrations from biological evolution show that perfect technique or perfect adaptation to an environment often proves an evolutionary cul-de-sac, and that the less specialized and more tentative organisms prove their survival power. The amphibians are contrasted favorably with the fishes, and the rat-like ancestors of man with their contemporaries, the giant reptiles. In the industrial sphere, the success of a particular community in the first stages of a new technique, e.g. in the invention of the paddle steamer, makes that community slower than others to adopt the more efficient screw propeller. A brief review of the history of the art of war from David and Goliath to the present day shows that, at each stage, the inventors and beneficiaries of one innovation proceed to rest on their oars and allow the next innovation to be made by their enemies. The suicidalness of militarism. The three previous sections have presented illustrations of resting on one's oars, which is the passive way of succumbing to the nemesis of creativity. We now pass on to the active form of aberration, summarized in the Greek formula kopos, viphippis. Militarism is an obvious example. The reason why the Assyrians brought ruin on themselves was not because, like the victors reviewed at the end of the previous chapter, they allowed their armor to rust. From a military standpoint, they were continuously and progressively efficient. Their ruin came because their aggressiveness exhausted them, besides rendering them intolerable to their neighbors. The Assyrians are an example of a military frontier province turning its arms against the interior provinces of its society. The similar cases of the Austrasian Franks and Timur-Lenk are also examined, and other examples are cited. The intoxication of victory, a theme similar to that of the preceding paragraph, is illustrated from a non-military sphere by the example of the Hildebrandine papacy, an institution which failed after raising itself and Christendom from the depths to the heights. It failed because, intoxicated by its own success, it was tempted to make illegitimate use of political weapons in pursuit of inordinate aims. The controversy over investiture is examined from this standpoint. V. The disintegrations of civilizations. 17. The nature of disintegration. A general survey. Is disintegration a necessary and invariable consequence of breakdown? Egyptiac and Far Eastern history show that there is an alternative, namely petrifaction, which was also nearly the fate of the Hellenic civilization and may be the fate of our own. The outstanding criterion of disintegration is the schism of the body social into three fractions: dominant minority, internal proletariat, and external proletariat. What has already been said about these fractions is recapitulated, and the plan of the following chapters is indicated. Schism and palingenesia. The apocalyptic philosophy of Karl Marx proclaims that the class war will be followed, after the dictatorship of the proletariat, by a new order of society. Apart from Marx's particular application of the idea, this is what actually happens when a society falls into the tripartite schism already noticed. Each of the fractions achieves a characteristic work of creation, the dominant minority a universal state, the internal proletariat a universal church, and the external proletariat barbarian warbands. 18. Schism in the body. Social dominant minorities. Though militarists and exploiters are conspicuous among the characteristic types in dominant minorities, there are also nobler types, the legists and administrators who maintain the universal states, and the philosophic inquirers who endow societies in decline with their characteristic philosophies, e.g. the long chain of Hellenic philosophers from Socrates to Plotinus. Examples are cited from various other civilizations. Internal proletariats. The history of the Hellenic society shows an internal proletariat recruited from three sources: citizens of the Hellenic states disinherited and ruined by political or economic upheavals, conquered peoples, victims of the slave trade. All alike are proletarians in feeling themselves in, but not of the society. Their first reactions are violent, but these are followed by gentle reactions culminating in the discovery of higher religions such as Christianity. This religion, like Mithraism and its other rivals in the Hellenic world, originated in one of the other civilized societies conquered by Hellenic arms. The internal proletariats of other societies are examined and similar phenomena observed, e.g. the origins of Judaism and Zoroastrianism in the internal proletariat of the Babylonic society were similar to those of Christianity and Mithraism in the Hellenic society, though, for reasons given, their later development was different. The transformation of the primitive Buddhist philosophy into the Mahayana provided a higher religion for the Cynic internal proletariat. The internal proletariat of the Western world. Abundant evidence can be adduced of the existence of an internal proletariat here, among other things, the existence of an intelligentsia recruited from the proletariat as an agent of the dominant minority. The characteristics of an intelligentsia are discussed. The internal proletariat of the modern Western society has, however, shown itself markedly unfertile in the production of new higher religions, and it is suggested that this is due to the continued vitality of the Christian Church from which Western Christendom was born. External proletariats. So long as a civilization is growing, its cultural influence radiates into and permeates its primitive neighbors to an indefinite distance. They become a part of the uncreative majority, which follows the creative minority's lead. But when a civilization has broken down, the charm ceases to act, the barbarians become hostile and a military frontier establishes itself which may be pushed far afield but ultimately becomes stationary. When this stage has been reached, time works on the side of the barbarians. These facts are illustrated from Hellenic history. Violent and gentle responses by the external proletariat are pointed out. The pressure of a hostile civilization transforms primitive fertility religions of the external proletariat into religions of the Olympian, divine warband type. The characteristic product of triumphant external proletariats is epic poetry. External proletariats of the Western world. Their history is reviewed and violent and gentle responses of the external proletariats are illustrated. Owing to the overwhelming material efficiency of the modern Western society, barbarism of the historic type has almost disappeared. In two of its remaining strongholds, Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, native rulers are protecting themselves by adopting imitations of Western culture. However, a new and more atrocious barbarism has become rampant in the ancient centers of Western Christendom itself. Alien and indigenous inspirations. Dominant minorities and external proletariats are handicapped if they have an alien inspiration. For example, universal states founded by alien dominant minorities are less successful in making themselves acceptable than indigenous universal states like the Roman Empire. Barbarian warbands provoke much more stubborn and passionate opposition if, like the Hyksos in Egypt and the Mongols in China, their barbarism is tinged by the influence of an alien civilization. On the other hand, the higher religions produced by internal proletariats generally owe their attractiveness to an alien inspiration. Nearly all the higher religions illustrate this fact. The fact that the history of a higher religion cannot be understood unless two civilizations are taken into account, the civilization from which it has derived its inspiration and the civilization in which it has taken root, shows that the assumption on which this study has hitherto been based, the assumption that civilizations, taken in isolation, are intelligible fields of study, begins at this point to break down. 19. Schism in the soul. Alternative ways of behavior, feeling and life. When a society begins to disintegrate, the various ways of behavior, feeling and life characteristic of individuals during the growth stage are replaced by alternative substitutes, one passive, the other active. Abandon and self-control are alternative substitutes for creativity, truancy and martyrdom for the discipleship of mimesis. The sense of drift and the sense of sin are alternative substitutes for the elon which accompanies growth, the sense of promiscuity and the sense of unity for the sense of style, which is the subjective counterpart of the objective process of differentiation which accompanies growth. On the plane of life, there are two pairs of alternative variations upon the movement towards a transfer of the field of action from the macrocosm to the microcosm, which underlies the process previously described as etherealization. The first pair of alternatives, archaism and futurism, fail to achieve this transfer and breed violence. The second pair, detachment and transfiguration, succeed in making the transfer and are characterized by gentleness. Archaism is an attempt to put back the clock, futurism an attempt at a short-cut to an impossible millennium on Earth. Detachment, which is a spiritualization of archaism, is a withdrawal into the fortress of the soul, an abandonment of the world. Transfiguration, which is a spiritualization of futurism, is the action of the soul which produces the higher religions. Examples of all four ways of life and of their relations to each other are given. Finally, it is shown that some of these ways of feeling and life are primarily characteristic of souls in dominant minorities, others of souls in proletariats. Abandon and self-control are defined, with examples. Truancy and martyrdom are defined, with examples. The sense of drift and the sense of sin. The sense of drift is due to a feeling that the whole world is ruled by chance, or necessity, which is shown to be the same thing. The wide range of the belief is illustrated. Certain predestinarian religions, e.g. Calvinism, are productive of remarkable energy and confidence, and the cause of this, at first sight, curious fact is considered. Whereas the sense of drift normally acts as an opiate, the sense of sin should be a stimulus. The doctrines of karma and original sin are discussed. The Hebrew prophets furnish the classic case of the recognition of sin as being the true, though not the obvious, cause of national misfortunes. The teaching of the prophets was taken over by the Christian Church and was thus introduced to a Hellenic world which for many centuries had been unconsciously preparing itself to receive it. The Western society, though inheriting the Christian tradition, seems to have discarded the sense of sin, which is an essential part of that tradition. The sense of promiscuity, this is a passive substitute for the sense of style characteristic of civilizations in course of growth. It manifests itself in various ways, vulgarity and barbarism in manners. The dominant minority shows itself prone to proletarianization, adopting the vulgarities of the internal and the barbarisms of the external proletariat, until, in the final stage of dissolution, its way of life has become indistinguishable from theirs. Vulgarity and barbarism in art is the price commonly paid for the abnormally wide diffusion of the art of a disintegrating civilization, lingue francaise. The intermingling of peoples leads to confusion and mutual competition of languages. Some of them spread as lingue francaise, and in every case their expansion entails a corresponding debasement. Many examples are examined as illustrations. Syncretism in religion. Three movements are to be distinguished: the amalgamations of separate schools of philosophy, the amalgamations of separate religions, e.g. the dilution of the religion of Israel by combination with the neighboring cults, which was opposed with ultimate success by the Hebrew prophets, and the amalgamation or syncretism of philosophies and religions with one another. Since philosophies are a product of dominant minorities and higher religions a product of internal proletariats, the interaction here is comparable with that illustrated in above. Here, as there, though the proletarians move some way towards the position of the dominant minority, the dominant minority moves a far greater distance towards the position of the internal proletariat. For example, the Christian religion employs for its theological exegesis the apparatus of Hellenic philosophy, but this is a small concession compared with the transformation undergone by Greek philosophy between the ages of Plato and of Julian. Quaes regio eius religio? This section is a digression arising out of the case of the philosopher Emperor Julian considered at the end of the previous section. Can dominant minorities make up for their spiritual weakness by using political force to impose the religion or philosophy of their choice? The answer is that, subject to certain exceptions, they will fail, and the religion which seeks the support of force will grievously injure itself thereby. The one apparently striking exception is the case of the spread of Islam, and this is examined and shown to be not really as much of an exception as it at first appears to be. An opposite formula, religio regionis religio regis, is nearer the truth. A ruler who, from cynicism or conviction, adopts the religion of his subjects prospers thereby. The sense of unity, this is the active antithesis of the passive feeling of promiscuity. It expresses itself materially in the creation of universal states, and the same spirit inspires the concepts of an omnipotent law or an omnipresent Godhead pervading and ruling the universe. These two concepts are examined and illustrated. In the latter connection, the career of Yahweh, the jealous God of the Hebrews, is traced from his beginnings as the djinn of a Sinaitic volcano to his eventual sublimation as the historic vehicle for a purified and exalted conception of the one true God who is worshipped by the Christian Church, and an explanation is offered of his triumph over all his rivals. Archaism. This is an attempt to escape from an intolerable present by reconstructing an earlier phase in the life of a disintegrating society. Ancient and modern examples are given, the modern including the Gothic revival and the artificial revival, for nationalistic reasons, of a variety of more or less extinct languages. Archaising movements generally either prove sterile or transform themselves into their opposite, namely, futurism. This is an attempt to escape the present by a leap into the darkness of an unknown future. It involves a scrapping of the traditional links with the past, and is in fact revolutionism. In art, it expresses itself as iconoclasm. The self-transcendence of futurism as archaism may fall into the gulf of futurism, so futurism may rise to the heights of transfiguration. In other words, it may abandon the forlorn attempt to find its utopia on the terrestrial plane and may seek it in the life of the soul, untrammeled by time and space. In this connection, the history of the post-captivity Jews is examined. Futurism expressed itself in a series of suicidal attempts to create a Jewish empire on earth, from Zerubbabel to Bar Kokhba. Transfiguration in the establishment of the Christian religion. Detachment and transfiguration. Detachment is an attitude which finds its most uncompromising and exalted expression in a philosophy professing to represent the teaching of the Buddha. Its logical conclusion is suicide, for real detachment is possible only for a God. The Christian religion, on the other hand, proclaims a God who has voluntarily abandoned a detachment which it was clearly within his power to enjoy. God so loved the world. Palingenesia of the four ways of life here examined, transfiguration is the only one which presents a thoroughfare, and it does so by a transference of the field of action from the macrocosm to the microcosm. This is true also of detachment, but, whereas detachment is only a withdrawal, transfiguration is a withdrawal and return. A palingenesia, not in the sense of a rebirth of another example of an old species, but in the sense of a birth of a new species of society. XX. The relation between disintegrating societies and individuals. The creative genius as a savior in the growth stage. Creative individuals lead successful responses to successive challenges. In the disintegration stage, they appear as saviors of or from the disintegrating society. The savior with the sword. These are the founders and maintainers of universal states, but all the works of the sword prove ephemeral. The savior with the time machine. These are the archaists and futurists. These, too, take to the sword and suffer the swordsman's fate. The philosopher masked by a king. This is Plato's famous remedy. It fails on account of the incompatibility between the detachment of a philosopher and the coercive methods of political potentates. The God incarnate in a man. Various imperfect approximations fall by the way, and Jesus of Nazareth alone conquers death. XXI. The rhythm of disintegration. Disintegration proceeds not uniformly but by an alternation of routes and rallies. For example, the establishment of a universal state is a rally after the rout of a time of troubles, and the dissolution of a universal state is that final rout. As there is found to be usually one rally followed by a rout in the course of a time of troubles and one rout followed by a rally in the course of a universal state, the normal rhythm seems to be rout rally root rally rout, 3½ beats. This pattern is exemplified in the histories of several extinct societies, and then applied to the history of our own Western Christendom. WHH a view to ascertaining what stage in its development our society has reached. XXI. Standardization through disintegration. As differentiation is the mark of growth, so standardization is the mark of disintegration. The chapter concludes with an indication of the problems standing over for examination in the forthcoming volumes. End of last chapter. Argument. With that, it's end our session for the A Study of History by Arnold J. Toynbee. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you.